There are obviously bigger debates in play, and I was curious to hear Senator Cormann insisting that we had a supply problem and that demand, if anything, was not only not a problem but perhaps had been over-incentivised. Was very careful not to mention negative gearing capital gains tax exemption, which is obviously a very live debate, not just in this place at this time but around the country, is that one of the biggest unspoken incentives on the demand side at the moment are these huge tax expenditures which incentivise and directly drive demand for property investors to compete against first home buyers and owner-occupiers. I would be more than happy to engage very, very broadly on all elements of the debate, and I think if there's one thing maybe that we can all agree on is that our housing market is inordinately complex when you consider all of the factors that are colliding around issues like land supply, whether it be on the periphery of our great cities or developers who are attempting infill, either along public transport corridors or in areas where they might come into conflict with existing residents. Supply is clearly a problem. Building and construction costs and techniques, huge possibilities for innovation there because, yes, costs are high, although they certainly haven't escalated anything nearly as rapidly as the cost of land. The Australian Greens believe that there's enormous potential, for example, in the modular or prefabricated housing industry. Here is an opportunity to kickstart a new manufacturing sector. When you get prefab housing and construction technologies to scale, you're looking at plants that are very similar and employ people with very similar degrees of expertise to the auto industry. They are effectively production lines whereby boxes of components go in at one end and fully formed dwelling units come out at the other end that are then basically assembled very rapidly on site. There's plenty to talk about on the supply side and on the construction side. What bugs me, though, is the unwillingness of the government to engage in the debate, and thank goodness at least the Labor Party is willing to have the conversation, to engage in the debate on these other demand drivers that Senator Cormann quite correctly points out are there in the system, but refuse to engage in the debate around these huge tax expenditures and concessions to investors which drive demand. They drive competition, and it is the first home buyers and the owner-occupiers that are being priced out of the market, particularly an entire generation of younger people. But I am very well aware that it's not just young people who are priced out of the housing market. Now, if this is the case and this is the status quo, whether we agree with negative gearing, whether we deal with these tax concessions or not, because dealing with those two on their own, I tend to agree with some of the comments of Senator Day. It might be the first time I've said that in this place, or Senator Sinodinos when he addressed these questions directly yesterday. It's not a magic bullet. Addressing with those concessions by themselves won't fix housing affordability by itself. We need to look at the entire picture, and that is why I think it's so important that this concession is being pulled out from under people. Not necessarily because it succeeded too well or it was costing too much, but that take-up wasn't high enough. Why can't we have an intelligent and mature conversation, not with one side obsessing and focusing on the demand side and one side obsessing on the supply side, but with all of the complexities of the issue about housing affordability? Because as I indicated, and as many others indicated yesterday during the course of this debate, that's extremely distracting having these folks up here, but it's welcome to the Senate. That we need to engage with all of it rather than people simply obsessing on different components. And the people who are being priced out of the market at the moment, first home buyers, this is an incentive that directly makes it easier for people. If take-up wasn't enough, and it's my understanding, Senator Cormann, that you were here, you would have voted for this initiative, as your colleague Senator Bernardi did when it was first put in. Senator Bernardi had some extremely forthright and quite perceptive things to say. It's gone completely off the rails since then, but here's what he said. Actually, I withdraw that. He's not here to defend himself. But here's what he said in September 2008 when this bill was in debate. He said, "Any government initiative designed to tackle the current decline in housing affordability is certainly most welcome." This was in 2008, before the market went completely berserk. He said, "There can be no doubt that many Australian families are dismayed over rising housing costs. One of the goals for every parent is to see their children being able to afford their own home." Now, I'll pause in my quote here because the fact is I think we're seeing a generation of people who will never be able to afford their own home, a generation of people who will probably rent for life. And we can have an argument about whether that's an ideal state of affairs or not, but the fact is we need to be dealing with security of tenancy and tenure for those people, and not assuming that it is A, everyone's aspiration, or B, that everybody will eventually, one way or another, find their way into their own home. Senator Bernardi went on, he said, families and young people really do need every help that the government can give them so that they can continue to save and afford their own home. This was recognised by the former coalition government last year when it committed to a similar scheme. He had a few criticisms then about the Rudd scheme, but nonetheless the coalition voted for it. The Labor Party obviously brought it forward, and today the axe is coming down on it with no real explanation. So, Senator Cormann, before we commit these amendments to vote, I would like to know whether the coalition, whether it was your ERC or whoever it was that decided to axe this incentive, whether any discussion was undertaken or were any discussions with people in the housing affordability sector or people trying to get into their own homes, whether there was any discussion about advertising, for example, or going out and actually advocating or encouraging people to take up this concession, or whether the decision was made rather more arbitrarily than that.
Thank you, Senator Ludlam. Minister Cormann.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I can confirm for Senator Ludlam that the decision to proceed with this measure, as all of the relevant measures in budgets, was a decision by the Expenditure Review Committee and ultimately endorsed by the Cabinet, and consistent with appropriate conventions. Obviously, I will not disclose the nature of discussions in the Expenditure Review Committee and or in Cabinet. Now, having said that, there has of course been a Senate Economics Legislation Committee inquiry into this bill, and all relevant stakeholders have had ample opportunity to express their view. To give Senator Ludlam this assurance, though, as our government always does, we have very carefully considered all of the relevant information. We've very carefully considered the various options in front of us on how best to proceed into the future, and we made a judgment having considered relevant expert advice along the way. Now that is obviously how a good government operates, through an orderly and methodical process. But beyond that, I obviously can't assist Senator Ludlam much further.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Ludlam. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator Ludlam. Labor is supporting the abolition of the first-time saver accounts and therefore opposes these Greens amendments. While this is not necessarily a saving that we would have made ourselves in government, Labor is willing to work constructively with the government on sensible savings measures. Unfortunately, the take-up for first-home saver accounts has not been as high as we had expected. Approximately 50,000 accounts have been opened, containing total combined savings of only $540 million. This was reflected in the report of the Senate Economics Legislation Committee into this bill. At the time, as they were moving these amendments, I note that the Greens are supporting the government's unfair pension changes, which will have a far more significant impact. The leader of the Greens party, Senator Di Natale, and his colleagues have been dubbed into accepting a $2.4 billion pension cut in exchange for a 6-week extension to the deadline for submissions to the tax inquiry.
Order.
Not at all.
Order. Senator Ludlam.
Senator Collins, you couldn't help yourself, could you, through you, Mr Chair? I'm actually not going to take the bait. I'm going to keep this debate on topic, Senator Collins, where we're talking about housing affordability. But believe me, the Labor Party, you really haven't got the hang of being the opposition, have you? You really haven't got the hang of it. Senator Cormann, you indicated, I think in your second reading contribution, that banks— You're really not very good at it. Senator Cormann, you indicated in your second reading speech that banks had stopped opening these accounts. My understanding is that only 2 of the Big 4 had ceased offering first home saver accounts. Could you just clarify whether that's the case or whether in fact there are no financial institutions who offer these anymore?
Senator Cormann.
Senator Ludlam is right, and that is consistent with what I said before, that there are banks that have stopped providing them now. And if I go to the Australian Banking Association's submission to the Senate Economics Legislation Committee inquiry into this bill, what they've noted was that complex product rules and the availability of better savings products within the market have limited consumer interest in the scheme. And that is one of the reasons why the First Home Saver Account scheme has been particularly unsuccessful.
Senator Ludlam.
I'm happy to let the new chair take his spot. Senator Cormann, I put to you that the amount of money that you're saving over 5 years in abolishing the last housing affordability mechanism in the policy toolbox that you hadn't yet obliterated, it's almost as though you swept aside everything to do with housing affordability and homelessness, wiped it out, and this one particular instrument escaped your attention, so now you're coming back to squash it. The $134 million over 5 years is what we concede to property investors through negative gearing and capital gains tax discount arrangements every 6 days. Minister, had you considered, through you, Mr Chair, that you might actually be looking in completely the wrong place for savings, and will you take another look at what these two huge tax concessions to property investors are actually costing regular taxpayers?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. The Coalition and the Greens will obviously have to agree to disagree. This First Home Savers Accounts scheme, having been in place for 7 years, obviously is proven to be unsuccessful. I mean, the evidence is in. It has not had a material beneficial effect on housing affordability. The take-up is extremely low. The level of savings are extremely low. To the extent that it has any impact at all, it further boosts demand when demand for housing by first home buyers is actually not the problem when it comes to housing affordability. The government very clearly understands that in those markets where there is upward pressure on housing prices, that is as a result of supply not meeting the actual demand in the market. So if we want to improve housing affordability, we've got to boost supply, which obviously when you've got increasing prices, there is to a degree a response in the market, and we see that actually now in the national accounts. You will see that there is increased investment in dwelling construction, which on the face of it appears to be a direct response to the increasing prices in some markets across Australia. But beyond that, if we want to boost affordability, improve housing affordability on a sustainable basis, we've got to increase the supply of land, and we've got to bring down the cost of building a home in Australia. Building a home in Australia is significantly more expensive than in other comparable jurisdictions around the world. These are the sorts of areas that we should focus on because we need to improve the supply of housing in the context of obviously very strong demand. Now, in relation to the other measures that Senator Ludlam raised, I mean, he asked me a question about this in question time the other day. Let me confirm for him again that the government has absolutely no plans to revisit negative gearing. I remind him there's actually no such thing as negative gearing as a term or as a methodology within our tax laws. What is in our tax laws is what is reflected in our tax laws is the concept that tax applies to net income. That obviously when you incur relevant costs in generating an assessable income, there are allowable deductions against that assessable income to determine the taxable income. Now that is something that is a general principle in our tax laws, which we believe is appropriate. And we understand that the Greens have a different view. We let the Greens argue for higher taxes, and we will continue to argue that the current arrangements remain appropriate. Now, I mean, just to close on this, I mean, Senator Ludlam seemed to indicate that the Labor Party had a position to pursue changes to negative gearing. Well, I'm very pleased that he has been able to ascertain and discern what Labor's position on negative gearing actually is, because I struggle. I know that there's some people who try to increase their profile, who jump up at various times and express some views, but whenever the Labor leader, Mr Shorten, is asked a question about negative gearing. I know I'm just a humble non-English speaking background immigrant, and perhaps I don't understand the English language all that well, but I listened very carefully to what Mr Shorten has got to say, and quite frankly I can't figure out what Mr Shorten's position on negative gearing is. Is he in favour of the status quo, or is he in favour of change? I mean, he gave a press conference last week. I sat in my office in Perth and was genuinely listening very carefully. I've got an interest in this topic. And I thought he's giving a press conference. He was asked a question about negative gearing. I thought I'd listen very carefully and I'd see whether I can find out what the Labor opposition's position under the leadership of Bill Shorten is on negative gearing, and I was none the wiser at the end of his answer. I was none the wiser. If somebody in this chamber on the Labor side wants to clarify what Labor's position is on negative gearing, I'd be all ears. I'd be really interested. And I'm sure, Senator Ludlam, this is where we come back together. I'm sure that both of us would be very interested in what Labor's position is on negative gearing. But obviously this is not a subject of this bill, so you've invited me here to stray beyond the measures that are in front of us, it's probably remiss of me to have been taken that way by you, but I'm, as always, trying to be helpful.
Senator Ludlam.
It is always helpful when the minister is helpful. I think it feels as though we've just spent the last half hour effectively talking past each other. And when, Minister, you point out that there's no such thing as negative gearing, the Parliamentary Budget Office must have just imagined the $42 billion in savings over. I think perhaps now we are arguing about a technicality. Where we, I think, have a substantial disagreement, maybe it's not a term of art in tax law, but it's known commonly as negative gearing, is the idea of people acquiring an asset for the purpose of making a loss on it. And that the expectation is that other taxpayers, the vast majority of them locked out of the property market, should pick up that loss. I find that utterly objectionable. When it has driven the demand, and this is one other area where we are in agreement, that demand is a huge factor in housing affordability, one of the major drivers of demand are these massive tax concessions paid for by people on low and medium incomes, many of them themselves locked out of the property market, to incentivise bidding up the price of property and pricing first home buyers and owner-occupiers out of the market. Until the two of us can make eye contact on that, I suspect we are wasting our time. I don't want to verbal the Labor Party. You are absolutely right. I have no idea what their position is on many things, actually, but on this issue in particular of negative gearing, what I wanted to acknowledge is that, unlike yourselves, they hadn't slammed the door shut on debate. They are at least willing to take on the taboo, and I think is to your great discredit, through you, Chair, that you are not. I will now move Amendment 3 on sheet 7714 and hope in the few seconds remaining in this debate that somebody up that end of the chamber has a change of heart on behalf of first home buyers.
The question is that Schedule 1 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes.